Hello, everyone. This is Carol Scott with the National Ombudsman Resource Center, and I want to welcome you to the Technical Assistance TA Talk. This quarter's talk is on resident councils. Next slide, please. I want to again welcome you and tell you that everyone who has signed up for this webinar and stays on for at least 30 minutes through the Zoom meeting will receive automatically a certificate that you can turn in for your continuing education. And just a reminder that these technical assistant talks are held quarterly, and we're excited to have the topic this time being resident councils. I will give you a heads up that the next call of these TA talks will be in June, and the topic will be ombudsman and abuse, neglect, and exploitation casework and reporting. Next slide, please. So some housekeeping, please mute yourself, and at the end, don't raise your hand now, but at the end, if you want to speak, please raise your hand so that we can call on you. And you'll only be able to ask questions if you're on Zoom, not if you are listening to this through the Facebook live stream. And want to thank Katie Kohler with the NORC staff and Libby Laubert with the Consumer Voice staff for assisting in the background for this. You can submit any questions you have in chat at any time, and we'll try to address those either during our discussion or near the end. And please complete the evaluation that will show up when you leave this, this meeting. So next slide, please. Just some general things about resident councils. Resident councils have legal protections under the nursing home regulations. And I will, and maybe we'll mention this several times, these rules here and requirements and protections of resident councils apply to nursing homes. Each state licenses and has resident rights that apply to assisted living or other residential care communities. So most of what we're talking about today does have to do with nursing homes. But if you want to know what the rights are of residents who live in assisted living or other board and care type facilities, you'll need to look to your own regulations and laws, talk with your state ombudsman, or probably most of you locals already know what the requirements are. So this just says in the federal language that facilities have the right, must provide a space for resident or family groups, that that any person who attends these resident groups or family groups that only at that particular group's invitation, and that these groups have the right to submit their views, their questions, their issues, and that the facility must reply back to them. It doesn't say that they have to necessarily do everything and comply with everything, but they at least must take a look at the issues. Next slide, please. And then what does the ombudsman rule says? Well, the rule says that it is the responsibility of both the state program, the state ombudsman, and the local representatives, the staff and volunteers to promote and provide technical assistance for the development of and provide ongoing support for resident and family councils. Next slide. And this, again, in the reauthorization of the 2016 Older Americans Act, the language says provide technical support for actively encourage and assist in the development of resident and family councils. So throughout the federal law, it clearly says that facilities are to to assist in resident council development, and it is clearly the role of the Ombudsman program to also help with the development and continuation of the councils. Next slide. And then it's, as an ombudsman, it's your responsibility to encourage and support the development of, advocate with residents so their facilities fulfill their obligations, and attend meetings periodically with the permission of the resident council. Next slide. Our speakers today are Stephanie Wheeler. She is the Alaska State Ombudsman, and they have put together just some wonderful resources. I think you're going to really like them. Our other two speakers, Patty Ducaye, the Texas State Ombudsman, and Melissa Ty Whitaker, a managing local ombudsman from Amarillo, are going to talk about some of the exciting results of work that they have done with councils. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Stephanie, and just remind all of you, please put any questions you have into the chat, and we will have time at the end to address some of those. So Stephanie, thank you very much. And next slide.
Thank you, Carol. So as Carol mentioned, my name is Stephanie Wheeler, and I've been in my position as the Alaska State Ombudsman for almost 2.5 years. So when I first came on board, I had the opportunity to talk about the importance of resident councils with my predecessor, Teresa Holt, and that the project that they had just recently finished around developing a resident council toolkit. The purpose of the toolkit was to provide some guidance to help residents run an effective council meeting, and to provide staff with some guidelines on how they can best support resident councils. So the project provided an opportunity to educate staff in the facilities about the purpose of a resident council. It also helped staff to understand their role as support members, and to help staff learn about, and we hear this often, overperforming or overreaching in their role as designated staff to the resident council. So throughout the project, we really emphasized to the staff that residents really need to have the kind of direct, unfettered communication to address issues in a comfortable setting, and to have the support of staff working with the council. Next slide, please. So Carol mentioned the federal regulations, and those federal regulations really offer nursing home residents the right to meet with other residents to talk about what is working in the facility and what isn't working in the facility. A resident council is the process of ensuring this right is protected, and resident councils can play a very important role in improving the care and the quality of life for residents in a nursing home. So throughout this project, we helped facilities understand that resident council meetings are for the residents and are meant to be run by the residents. It really is an opportunity for residents to come up with ways to address problems in skilled nursing facilities. During the project, we also learned that that every resident council is ran differently. And so there's actually no right way to run a resident council. Since Carol reviewed the guidance of the federal regulations, I'm just going to go ahead and move on to the next slide. Thanks, Carol, for doing that. Had that on my agenda to do. So what the Resident Council Toolkit, in addition to the federal guidance, our team is guided by our program's policy and procedure for ombudsman, and we have this in our policy and procedure, which states, as Carol mentioned too, that ombuds provide technical assistance for the development of and provide ongoing support to councils to protect the well-being and rights of residents. So our role as ombudsman to really help support resident councils, and it really starts with educating both residents of the facility and facility owners or administration on the benefit of having a strong resident council. So since we had some baseline knowledge about resident councils, we wanted to expand on what we knew about councils or resident councils. And we figured out the best way to support resident councils in addition to being present or at least talking with council presidents. So the idea was to create a toolkit that would support all resident councils and include culturally appropriate information. Culturally appropriate information relevant to facilities. So how did we come about this idea? So Alaska has about 20 skilled nursing facilities. In 2019, we actually had 18. So 2 new facilities were created since then. And these skilled nursing facilities are located both on and off the road system. So we do a lot of travel and located in both rural and urban Alaska. So 3 of these facilities are part of tribal health organizations. The toolkit was created to address structure and the process of decision-making and advocating for change within facilities, with the goal that culturally appropriate resident councils can be established within each nursing facility within our state. We knew that the range of facility sizes and cultures and locations among the skilled nursing facilities meant that there would be no one single best fit for a resident council organizational structure. A toolkit, we thought, should support the development of a structure that fits the culture of the residents, the size of the resident community, and capacity to create change within the facility. It is also reasonable to expect smaller facilities to kind of have a less formal council, but decisions about formal structure should be made by the residents themselves. So slide 4. In 2019, my predecessor, Teresa Holt, contracted with 2 consulting companies, Kim Chapney of Chapney Consulting and Mary Elizabeth Ryder of Ryder Consulting. We also worked very closely with Dr. Jordan Lewis, who is a professor at the University of Alaska, Anchorage School of Social Work. Our team, along with the consultants, created this toolkit that provided ideas on best practices in helping residents to develop and run a resident council, and on ways that staff and others can support the resident council. So this was a long process, a lengthy process. The consultants did some information gathering. They did some research of other nursing home materials from other states. We did interviews, we did observations. So they researched information about cultural appropriate tools and resources, and a lot around communication. We also, the team also did site visits in Alaska while they conducted these interviews. The consultants actually established protocols for interviews, and they used one protocol as a guide for interviews with administrators and other staff in the skilled nursing facilities, and another protocol for resident council leaders or residents. All in all, the consultants conducted about 11 interviews with facility staff, 15 interviews with staff to resident councils, 11 interviews with resident council leaders, and they also interviewed other stakeholders, such as our state licensing and certification manager. We really wanted to put together a toolkit that would be best practices and that would work for everyone. So based on the research and the information that we gathered from the interviews and observations, the consultants created the first draft of the toolkit. And that draft included actually a handbook for residents and 2 manuals for staff and administrators. But after reviewing and evaluating the initial toolkit, we also had the opportunity to dig a little bit deeper and have additional conversations with administrators and with residents, just to see how this initial draft of the first toolkit would work. We also sent out a survey on SurveyMonkey to ask for feedback of the initial draft. We did a lot of follow-up work during a 10-week evaluation period. The information from the evaluation period helped us to, produce the final person-centered and culturally appropriate toolkit for residents. So what did we learn? Next slide. We learned about the value of resident councils to both facility staff and residents. We learned about what resident councils actually accomplish during their time, a residents' time together. We learned that communication was truly important all around from every angle. We learned that councils are an avenue to create person-centered activities. We learned that councils are an avenue for your voice to be heard. We learned that councils are an avenue to listen to concerns brought forth by residents. We learned that the councils are an avenue for residents sharing and providing advice to each other. We also learned that the council is an avenue to learn more about family members' concerns. And we got a chance to learn who the residents were who were attending the council meetings. So there's a mix of, for our Alaska skilled nursing facilities, the residents were a mix of cultures, Alaska Native cultures, Filipino cultures, Caucasian, African-American, Hispanic, you name it, and with different capacities, dementia, we had English language learners, there were residents who were considered medically acute, and residents who had some behavioral challenges. And here's a fast fact about diversity in Alaska. So in Anchorage, we have approximately 100 languages spoken in our Anchorage school district. So for us in Alaska, it's so important to have culturally appropriate resources and have that as a priority. So what did we learn about the meeting structure? We learned that most meeting structures are Western style, typically the president opens the meeting, staff prompts on the agenda, and some resident councils have no formal leaders, as no one wanted to take on that role. So they had more informal conversation, and if necessary, they had typically the activities director or staff designated to the council step in to help facilitate the meeting. So most councils act as a single body of the facility, but sometimes in the larger facilities, we had smaller group members of the council members who pulled in other residents to have informal conversations, and then they would take that information back to the larger council. We also had councils who chose to use the style of a talking circle, where you have a talking stick and pass along the stick to others when they finish speaking. So that was also a more informal approach, and it's really casual, and people had an opportunity to really talk during those council meetings and listen. So one of the other things that we discovered while doing this research, food was the main attraction to getting people to come to the meetings. So what were some of those challenges of the councils that they talked to us about? Councils struggled, of course, with a lack of attendance of and participation from residents, a lack of organizational responsiveness to facilities or from facilities, and of course, staff over involvement. And one of the larger concerns were the handling of complaints. Both residents didn't understand the complaint process or how to report or a complaint or the reporting system by residents, and not knowing how to officially file a complaint. And we addressed this in the toolkit as well. So we also learned that resident councils thought it was really important that to have ombudsmen attend the council meetings, there to ask them questions about rights, or for them to share information about any topic areas that they were concerned about. So next slide, council meetings. So after learning from staff's perspectives and residents' perspectives and challenges, we created this toolkit that contains information and examples of, all of the topics that you see listed on this slide, and additional information for each of those sections on how staff can support the council. So for each section, the toolkit, more specifically, the staff manual identifies or lays out the background and purpose of the topic. It goes into depth about what the staff's role is and how to best support the council. And it also highlights the council leader's role. So basically, the staff manual has all the tools that staff will need to help resident leaders run a resident council. Next slide. How am I doing on time? Am I almost there? So the final product, we have 2 videos. Those videos are narrated by Dr. Jordan Lewis. As I mentioned before, he's a professor at the School of Social Work for UAA. But
hi there. Well, the guy came.
Hello. So he is an Alaska Native from Naknek, Alaska, and he is also the director of National Resource Center for Alaska Native Elders. So if you listen to those videos, they're very easy to understand. He did just an amazing job. Our staff manual in this toolkit has over 100 pages. And it goes into thoughtful detail in addition to what is a resident council, why from beginning to end, why a council toolkit is needed, why is it important to know about historical trauma in Alaska, a guide on tribal nursing home best practices as it relates to trauma and person-centered care. The staff manual also goes into detail about communication and communicating with Alaska Native elders and other ethnic groups. There are also numerous checklists on what do resident councils do, what does a resident successful council look like. It's a checklist for resident council meetings and some basic rules for resident councils. This manual also includes examples of flyers and agendas and ways to inform residents about upcoming meetings, various ways to hold meetings, both formal and informal. I talked about talking circles, which is a pretty, a practice that we have here in Alaska. The staff manual talks about how to keep minutes and how to talk about problems and problem solving. There are ideas for activities. There's a section on how to run elections. There are other resources in the toolkit that includes specific information around residents' rights, the federal regulations about resident councils, and information about the Long-Term Care Ombudsman's office. So with that said, the final product, the toolkit is actually on our website, but we also did a wide distribution of the toolkit to skilled nursing facilities. We hand delivered hard copies right until COVID hit. And then after that, we mailed hard copies to others. We also provided thumb drives of the toolkit to each of the skilled nursing facility administrators and other facilities who actually wanted a copy. And we continue to ask for feedback about the toolkit and how it's working for staff and residents. So the last slide, the toolkit can be found on our website under the resource tab. So www.akoltco.org. Feel free to download the toolkit. I can also send you our final copy of the report from our consultants if anyone is interested in what took place and how we actually put together our toolkit and the research that we did. we recently had a new facility that opened up in Anchorage, in Maple Springs, Anchorage. They contacted our office, wanted to know if we had any information on how to create resident councils. And this toolkit was a perfect fit for them. And they were so excited and just really happy to have this toolkit to work with residents on starting a resident council. So that's all I have today, and I'm available to answer any questions after Patty and Melissa. So Patty, I'm handing this over to you. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Stephanie. Thank you so much. Such good work out of Alaska. We're excited to have those resources shared. Lots of people have asked about it. The website has been posted in the chat, so look there as well as on the slides that Stephanie just covered. So we're going to swing over to Texas for a little bit. I'm going to take just a few minutes of your time, and then you're going to hear from my colleague, Melissa Ty Whitaker. Next slide. Melissa, Ty, and I both asked some resident councils why they participate and why resident councils are important to them. So I've got a couple of things to share with you from the mouths of a couple of residents. And so here's one that should resonate. I certainly heard this from Stephanie, that being in the council is important because it's a way for people's voice to be heard. And then as a follow-up to that, one resident told me that our experiences during COVID, when things were really hot, we just didn't have a voice and we didn't have councils happening. And so because of those restrictions, she sees her role in the council more important than ever. And I'll come back to it and touch on COVID a little bit in a few minutes that I spend with you today. Next slide. I also asked why you're involved in a resident council, and a couple of things I wanted to say from residents is that it helps me feel connected when I'm helping others, and they see their participation in the council as a way to help their fellow residents, those who can't participate or choose not to, and to serve a purpose and feel needed feels good. So wonderful things that can come from being part of this that residents have said to us. Next slide, please. So I mentioned COVID. Right before COVID, we had finalized a resident council toolkit of our own in Texas. And I want to say a couple of things about that. Right before COVID, we had passed one of those booklets out, plastic on the outside, kind of nice and sturdy, large enough font that it was, we feel, easy to read, spiral bound and durable. We used civil money penalties, CMP monies, to print those toolkits and make one for every resident council president and an extra copy to be provided to, say, the liaison for the facility, so that there was one on hand should it get destroyed or lost or we needed new ones. And we're going to reprint those with some COVID-19 money that we have available, CARES Act money that we'll want to spend down. That toolkit and the approach that we took is actually more of an approach of resident councils are like your homeowners association. So we really tried to characterize things in that way and talk about the importance of watching out for your neighbors, participating in your neighborhood association, making changes through group voice and group complaints. And we have that toolkit available, of course, through NORC, and all these resources are available on the NORC site. And know they're going to cover that at the end of the presentation. And then I share with you this little photo of a lanyard. So this is our Texas Ombudsman badge and lanyard that we all have, and it's kind of royal blue Ombudsman, and we decided we wanted to contrast that for the resident council lanyards that we printed. We also used CARES Act money for this purchase, and we gave these to every member, every kind of executive role in a resident council, in every nursing facility and every assisted living facility in Texas. And so these weren't CMP funds, so we could use them for assisted living residents in this case. So we have handed those to the people who are taking on the position of president or vice president or chair or whatever they're called, and have gotten a really positive response from residents, just a way to identify themselves, to advertise that they are a part of the council, and to be identified as a leader within the organization, within the facility they live. Next slide. So I want to take this last couple of minutes to just mention what I see my role in the resident council support function. And so what I see as the state ombudsman is I need to help residents and the ombudsman here, right there at the facility, help them do what they need to do and do what they want to do. So I'm working to support both the individual interests of residents, the group interests of residents, and then also really I have this function of supporting all the managers of our program so that they can do the things that they want to help support them as well. So I mentioned here that we have a policy in the state of Texas that any systems advocacy that's performed by one of the ombudsmen, who isn't me, SO is state ombudsman, then they have to basically consult with me to ensure that whatever actions they're planning to take are supported by my office overall. And so as an example, one of my managers in the state of Texas came to me and said, okay, I've got a resident council. They're a group of motivated residents. They want to work on personal needs allowance and get that amount increased this year. So that began early in 2021, and the ombudsman came to me to ask me for help because she saw this as a potential systems advocacy activity for her. So next slide. And this is my last slide. So it's just a way to talk to you about what I did in response to that I helped that manager think about, okay, what's going to be your plan? You know what residents want, that you can see that kind of final outcome of higher amounts of their personal needs allowance. We get $60 in Texas if you're a Medicaid recipient in a nursing facility. And so what do we need to do to get to increase it, and what amount do they want to increase it by? And so the plan that I talked with our ombudsman about was how to approach the residents and talk to them about this issue. How do we educate the resident on what has to change? Even the process of just talking about this as a state law, because that's how it's set in the state of Texas and probably in most of your states too. And then I developed key messages and some prompts for residents that the ombudsman could use right in the, person to person, explaining to the residents, we need to hear personal stories. This is what we want to tell legislators in order to influence them and get a bill filed and passed that enhances and increases your personal needs amount. And so that key messages material, that's available to you as a resource for today's presentation if it's useful to you. And then finally, we helped the same ombudsman after she collected letters from the residents. She wrote a cover letter. We recommended that she do this, that pulled from those examples of various residents. And she wrote a letter to the legislators to kind of explain the whole idea and the whole concept, and to help those legislators see that people living in our nursing facilities have a voice and chose to speak to them directly, and we're helping communicate that message and that request to their elected officials. So that is just one example that I wanted to share with you as a way that state ombudsman can help support an individual resident council's interest and activities. And I'm going to pause there and transfer over to Melissa Ty out of the Texas Panhandle. Hi, Melissa.
Hello, can you hear me? All right, I'm Melissa Ty Whitaker. I'm the managing local ombudsman for the top 26 counties. I am based out of Amarillo. That's going to be our COG, our Council of Government that we work out of. And we cover about 26,000 miles in our area. That includes 68 facilities, I believe. And then within that, we have a lot of farming and ranch land. So our population is fairly resilient as well as outspoken in our residents in our facilities, our long-term care facilities. So I actually attended a facility resident council meeting last week. And I wanted to ask them, why was resident council important to them? Next slide, please. So a lot of the residents in the area, I think, had the same opinions, but they were mainly concerned, with how things were going in the facility. A lot of them said, we are people, we're not just patients who live here every day. We don't get to go home to our families because we don't have a home or families to go home to anymore. They also had residents speak about staff should be more understanding and empathetic to their situations because it may be them one day. I had one resident who was very outspoken. She said staff wouldn't have a paycheck if it wasn't for us. They ought to be a little nicer. But I think that, resident councils are there for a purpose. And so in speaking with the residents, I asked them, what is your purpose? If you can go to the next slide, please. I have a lot of residents who believe that it's important for the facility to know their voices and their opinions. I also had a resident mention that it's a time for residents to recognize the staff members who are doing a good job, and that a positive reinforcement goes a lot further than complaining on staff constantly. So I think that resident councils are not always about just grievances. They can be productive in other ways, like this encouraging staff. I think our staff have been through a lot in the last 2 years, and so maybe some positive reinforcement from the residents would be helpful. They also help to choose activities, and I even have a facility in which the residents even collaborate with the facility to create the nursing facility newsletter. And so that seems to be really neat to get information out for advocacy for residents who want to advocate for themselves. Let's see, next slide, please. So I understand that resident councils may have understandably diminished over the last 2 years, but I feel like it is important that resident councils gain that interest again. And so we want to help move residents forward to ensure that they do have a safe place to advocate for themselves. So we were asked, how to gain interest in the council. A lot of groups and ombudsman, local ombudsman have the swag, the ombudsman pens or pencils and interesting things like that residents just love. We have flashlights and little notepads and things like that. So that's always a fun way to get people into resident council. We have a lot of information we print out from the National Consumer Voice. Those are always really colorful and easy to read. So having that makes it helpful in council meetings to have that appealing handout. Of course, we always have our ombudsman brochures and the normal literature that we give out. So we have those on hand and kind of just set up a little information setting whenever we're there to make sure we can give Medicaid information out if they need that. Resident rights, we have postcards. So anything that would be helpful that they could take back to their rooms. We also see resident councils be on the meal of the month. And so they can choose, a meal of the month and all the residents in the facility are allowed to do that and be involved in that process. So that's a fun way. As well as the special outings. We have a lot of residents who like to go on field trips. And so I had a facility in the North Texas area who they go on fishing trips a lot during the summer, and they absolutely.
As resident council?
And so during that time, they have the resident council meetings out at the lake. And so that's been a good way for the activity director to get more participation in resident council because they get to go to the lake and go fishing, and some of the ladies just hang out on the dock. And so that's kind of nice. We also encourage residents to invite decision makers to attend, if they're having concerns about food, to invite dietary. So that's always a good way to make their concerns voiced and heard to the facility staff. I think as ombudsman, though, it is important for ombudsman to go and speak with residents personally and invite them to participate in the resident council. I think that in explaining how it enables them to advocate for themselves and as a group. If you can have one person with a lot of concerns placed in a group that can remain anonymous, the sheer numbers of resident council help to make those concerns and complaints a little more valid for the facility, and not just being that one resident who complains all the time. Because normally these complaints are systemic in our facilities, and I think that resident council gives a venue for residents to have that bigger voice for our staff. You can also encourage residents to participate as an officer. I think we all know our residents very well, and we know those residents who advocate more or speak up for more for themselves, and even speak up for their fellow residents. And so encouraging them to serve, on the board for the resident council is always a good way to do that. Let's see, what content do residents want? So we do use the toolkits because we don't necessarily want resident council to just be a time for residents to just solely just complain. We want this to be a productive group meeting. And so I think that whenever we bring these toolkits to the resident council meetings, that helps gear up the residents to make it an organized working system that makes it productive for them to have concerns addressed and resolved. So if you go to a resident council and it's kind of stagnant and you feel like there's not a lot of conversations going on, we always encourage starting with resident rights. That is a big talking point. There are a lot of resident rights to cover. And so going through those, we'll start bringing up conversations of, well, they were talking about my information in front of other residents. Do I have that right to privacy? And so I think that it's really helpful to start with residents' rights. And then, of course, the common issues and concerns that we all hear and work with daily. Next slide, please. So the common concerns that we normally get from our resident council meetings are going to be food. It seems like green beans is a big arguing point around here. In Texas, we put bacon on everything. And so a lot of our residents really want bacon in the green beans. I get that comment a lot. That's not always helpful whenever you have high sodium or low sodium diets. But we address a lot of food complaints and green bean complaints. Of course, staff friendliness is brought up a lot because I think that in our area, we're still very low staffed, and it's a lot for these staff to burden the amount of hours they're working, as well as the low staffing issues that come with that. And so the friendliness of the staff is diminished as well, and it has this trickle down effect on our residents. So that is a big talking point. Call out response time, that is always a concern. We get that daily and the majority of time when we're in a facility. Of course, that has to do with staff ratios. We did work on some situations though where the call outs were not working properly, and so we involved regulatory in our area to work with the facility to get working call outs. And so sometimes it's not just the staffing, it's just that the button doesn't really work, and so that ended up being an issue at a few facilities in our area because we started testing those while we were in the facility. Also, infection control is a big talking point. We have a lot of facilities that are still, we're 2 years in and they're still just not wearing the mask properly, as well as not really cleaning surfaces or creating and following those protocols for infection control. And so that's a hot topic too, because residents are still genuinely concerned for their safety. And they feel that if staff aren't taking that seriously, how can they be safe? And so we have a lot of those calls still in our area. But I think that resident council is an interesting and exciting venue for us because, we get so many of the doom and gloom calls and the discharge appeals and those harder topics and subjects that we have to cover with residents. So resident council is a more fun way to advocate for residents and with residents. And so I think that in facilities, it's nice to be able to hear their concerns and to show them how they do have a way to advocate for themselves and empower themselves to make big changes in their facilities. So it's another way to do our job, just a little more fun. That's it.
Melissa, Patty, Stephanie, thank you, thank you, thank you. Lots of great ideas, and I hope everybody's looking in the chat. Patty has been adding on to some of the things that you've been saying, and you know, giving you high fives for the ideas. Next slide, please. So just real quickly, these are the and I put into the chat the link to the advocacy that Patty was talking about regarding the personal needs allowance. Here they are again. Next slide, please. There's also a brand new PowerPoint presentation that Katie and other staff worked on. And you are welcome to take that. This particular one was just used a couple of weeks ago in Virginia. So, but lots of great information in this presentation that is designed for residents to tell them, you know, kind of what councils are and what they are not. And this presentation is on the NORC website. Next slide, please. All of the resources, I'm sorry, this particular one is resident council rights in nursing homes. And again, as I mentioned at the very beginning, we're able to put something like this together because it's a national, the standards and the regulations are the same for nursing homes across the country. You'll have to check within your own state to see what the resident council rights are in assisted living or other non-nursing home settings. But this is a great flyer here, this fact sheet. Next slide, please. This is a flyer on what's the law, and this contains information again about what facilities are required to do, and what the rights are of resident councils. Next slide, please. This is information and resources about ways for residents to overcome the obstacles. You know, if they won't provide the space, if they insist that a staff person be in the meeting. So you can look through this, and again, these slides have all been put into the chat, and they will also be sent out when we send out the notice of the recording and everything. Next slide, please. This is a Powtoon that talks about resident rights and includes the right to have a council. Next slide, please. And then, any additional information that's out on the NORC website can be found under issues at the homepage at the top. Issues, go to the F for family, and the link there is for family and resident councils, and you can find resources that NORC has made, resources that Ombudsman programs have made. And then you can also go to the Consumer Voice Resident Council Center, click on this, and there's all kinds of resources there for residents and families. Next slide, please. So we are at the Q&A, and I'm gonna say that for the last few minutes while I've been talking, everybody's been chatting, and of course I haven't been able to read those. So I'm gonna go to the questions that came in earlier. And so I'm just going to ask the question. Any Stephanie, Patty, or Melissa, any of you are welcome to jump in and answer. And we have only about 10 minutes, so we'll try to keep our answers very short. Suggestions needed in getting residents excited about resident councils, as well as running for board positions.
Well, Melissa Ty tried to mention that in her slide, that one thing is to be personally asked. So an ombudsman can do some good here if you can go to some residents and say, you know, I see you as a leader around here. It would be great if you signed up to be president or chair or the secretary. So that's one thought.
Yeah,
Perfect.
I concur with that, Patty. Melissa might want to expand on that as well, but during our research, we also found that it was, challenging to get some of the residents to attend council meetings. And one of the several of the resident councils explained that, if you have food, people will come, people will show up. So food seems to be one of those things that you offer, and people will show up and then find out a little bit more about what resident councils are from the residents' perspective. So have food.
Great, thank you. And I think that's exactly right. I think the issue here is that we may assume that they know what a resident council is just because we know, well, I know what a resident council is, but people don't know that. So making sure that you're starting with the very basics. And it's also possible that there's been a bad experience, that in fact, they've had a council before and maybe an unbearable person ran it and didn't let anyone else have a say, or it was run by the facility. So you may just have to start from scratch, have the food, make it, and allow it to grow. You don't have to have 30 people at the council meeting to get it started. You can start with 3 or 5 or 10 and then let it grow over time. The next council is, okay, ways to encourage resident councils to be run by residents versus facility staff. How about that's what the law says? Oh, no, Patty.
No, I'm sort of, that's good, Carol. That's right. It's the hardest thing. Some facilities have done a great job of that, and it's a resident who's really willing to comfortable and willing to step up. And I know that there are a lot of us experiencing facilities where you just can't hardly get anyone to serve in a board seat at all. So I don't have any wonderful answers for that. I recognize the problem.
Yeah, I think it's a teachable moment too for residents, and helping residents understand that their role is to really run the council. During our research time, it was definitely noted that, staff had a tendency to overreach their role, but how to encourage staff to take the back seat. Part of that is, staff helping to role model with residents or teaching residents how to lead the council so that they feel more comfortable with doing so. And then residents speaking up to say, I believe this is my role as the council leader to conduct or facilitate the meeting. So.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm afraid each one of these questions is going to lead to, oh my gosh, there is so much information that we are not going to be able to say in just 1 hour. So I encourage people to take a look at all the resources that are out there and to ask each other questions. So the next question, in light of the pandemic, what suggestions do you have for continuing the resident council efforts? And Stephanie, I'd love the idea of going outside. I love the idea of going outside and having the meeting there. Any other suggestions for facilities?
I have a resident council who, we have a lot of small towns around here. So they'll just go down to Main Street or, their closest little restaurant, and they have ice cream socials. And so you get the cheap food. A lot of them are on that small personal needs allowance. And so they'll be able to get an ice cream cone and then conduct their business there. It's just a nice way to, and even if the van can't take them down there, at least try to have it outside on the patio. Residents have been cooped up for a long time over the last few years. And so just getting them outside and in a different place a different scene is always helpful, and residents are more willing to participate if they get to go do something. So
Thank you. I think that's a real hard thing when we know that there are facilities that are still not encouraging group activities. And so if residents are experiencing that, they obviously can reach out to the Ombudsman program and ask, ask for assistance in explaining that there might be a way to have a group activity that's still safe. And so whether it's masking up or just being spread out and having some, maybe some microphone or something that would allow people to hear each other. So is it appropriate for Ombudsman to ask questions at resident council meetings, or are we present to listen to this discussion and allow the talking time to the residents?
I'll jump in here. Oh, Stephanie.
No, go ahead, Patty.
I'd say residents' voices certainly need to come first, and I think we all know that. But being courteous, if we see an opportunity for a question we feel like needs to be asked, is certainly, if we're doing that respectfully and we're asking it to the person in charge, who is the resident in charge, asking for their permission to ask a question or two about the subject they've brought up, I think that's perfectly acceptable. Ombudsmen need to be aware that we're not dominating that conversation in any way, even if there are painful silences.
Definitely agree with that. And sometimes it's helpful to have a conversation with the resident council president or resident council leadership prior to the meeting, just so that they get to know who you are and ask. And, specifically if you have anything that you want to share. We have voting rights material coming up. And so so having a conversation with the leadership, the resident council leadership prior to the meeting, and if it's an opportunity, for sharing, they can open that window of time so Ombudsman can share. But also, I think it's really important that they know you're there to help them answer any questions about issues that they might have as well. So.
Okay, thank you. What if a facility does not have a family council? Can family members attend the resident council meetings if invited by a resident?
I'll jump in and say, first, it depends on what that council's bylaws may be. So if any rules have been set up by a facility, we need to honor those. And so it's a little hard to give a blanket answer to the question. I would say, generally speaking, if there is no bylaw that or similar kind of policy that the group has set for themselves, then it's a matter of bringing that question to a council for consideration. Generally speaking, we don't see a resident council as an opportunity for family members to participate, because in Texas, and certainly it seems plausible in every other state, family members could form a group of their own. And we think that quickly family interests might overtake, even though they may be shared interests, but might overtake the voices of the residents. So that would be our sort of starting points in Texas.
Great, thank you. I think there's a lot of different parts of this question also about, who can invite. And I think, Patty, your answer is right on. That depends on what the group says. Some are very formal and have bylaws that need to be followed. Others, it's more just of a conversation. But even if the person is the council president, doesn't necessarily mean that they get to choose who gets to come and go. Although in some instances, it will be that council president who will have invited certain staff to come in. But in that invitation, it is please come to the beginning of the meeting, and then we're going to ask you to leave. So there should always be an opportunity, even if there's a staff liaison, there should always be an opportunity for residents to be able to run the show for however long they want to before they ask the liaison to come back in, or before somebody hands them, here's the notes to add to what you already were taking. And this might be for people in the chat. Is anyone aware of a council that is part of the staff hiring process? And I know I've heard of these before, where there'd be a couple of council members who might interview CNAs and other staff. But if in the chat, if you are aware of a resident council that does that, please shout that out. Let's see.
Carol, I know the time's up, but I did see a couple of chat questions that really kind of leaned on the question of a bad council, one that's gotten really dysfunctional, something along those lines, or just running, just rubber stamp that they've got a council. And that seems like a really great topic to maybe try to find some time for. I think we've all experienced it, and it can take some really intensive work, say by an ombudsman, if the residents are willing to let you get involved, to try and work through that conflict that may have emerged within a group. It can be very complicated.
Absolutely. Next slide. And we are out of time, but we'll stay on for just a few more minutes if people want to. Michael, I see that you are raising your hand. If you want to unmute yourself.
Yes, at the Veterans Home where I've been an ombudsman, the resident council there has always, as far as I've known, over like 10 years, always had staff members attending. One of the staff members is actually taking the notes of the meeting, and there's usually another staff member that's always there too. The recreational services director, she comes in and gives a schedule of what the activities are coming for the next 30 days, whether they're going to an outing for a ball game or a fishing trip or whatever.
Yeah, and I think that's sometimes is a agenda item, but that should not be the purpose of the whole council. And it's I don't know, you guys, it's hard, isn't it, when the council becomes the place that the facility brings them. Okay, we're going to have a theme for the month. You guys, here's 2 ideas. Which one do you like? And then they go, oh, see, the council's giving us input. Well, yeah. And so I don't know, Stephanie, Patty, Melissa, anyone have a comment? No. Okay. Well, thank you. Thank you. I appreciate your work with the council there. And I think any of us would be happy to talk with you more. You might get a hold of Jenny Hollingsworth in the State Ombudsman office and see if she's got any thoughts. Okay, I'm gonna say that we need to close this. I know we could talk more and more and more. I want to thank Stephanie, Patty, and Melissa, and Katie and Libby in the background. We will continue to answer questions if you guys email us. And I'm sorry that my answering machine is in the background. So, okay, well, now it goes away. Okay, listen, thank you all. Obviously, an hour is not enough time to talk about all the intricacies of resident councils. And so thank you again, speakers, and look forward to hearing from many of you if you have questions, or if you have good examples of things that you're seeing a council in your area do. Everybody have a great day, and we'll see you next quarter, the end of June, to talk about abuse, neglect, and exploitation.
Thanks, everyone.